The reason that I wanted you two to come talk to us will probably become quite apparent, but if you can just introduce yourselves, starting with Heather, kind of just tell people, they can see, a few words about you there, but tell people how you got to this place on this chair today, and, just a few things about yourself.
Yeah, so can everyone hear me? We didn't do a sound check before, so sorry. Can you hear me okay? Not quite. Let me try it over here. Yeah.
Some people can hear you.
Can you hear me in the back? You can hear me? Okay, good. All right, good. So Heather Mickman, currently VP at Optum Tech, which is part of UnitedHealth Group, a apparently just recently Fortune 5 company, was Fortune 6. There I'm accountable for our modernization of our API strategy and the platforms required to do that work. And yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, always, right? I think interesting. Like, how much time do you spend talking about what your journey is to have gotten there? So briefly, I grew up in the Twin Cities in the northern suburbs. Went to school at Macalester, got my degree in math and economics. After school, I ended up out in the Bay Area in San Francisco. I was working for Anderson Consulting, Accenture now, and had a lot of really interesting experience while I was out there. I was in their supply chain practice, and supply chain software in the late 90s was really immature. And so I got to work with a number of different startups on different software that was being built. Spent a lot of time at Sun Microsystems, at Compaq, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, Amgen. So got a lot of really interesting experience. Also included a lot of travel, as often people that work for Accenture experience. And I kind of burnt out in my late 20s, even though it was a job that I really loved. And so I left tech for a bit and went to work for my dad. And so my dad's got a medium-sized family business in the northern suburbs, and anyone from the northern suburbs might recognize it as Mickman Brothers. So sprinkler system, irrigation, garden center, and one of the largest wreath manufacturers in the country. Who knew? But it's a thing, and my dad makes a really great living doing it. And so I worked for him for a couple of years and learned. I always say, like, every job that I have, I learn something very valuable. And what I learned from my dad, and something that I take very to heart in my leadership style, was how to not be a micromanager. Like, he is an incredible micromanager. And I said, Dad, I love you. However, I can't work for you because I need you to tell me the outcome that you want, not like how specifically, every step along the way, what it is that we're doing. And so after working with my dad for a couple of years, I started working at Target. I was at Target for about 10 years or so. Lots of great experiences working across the IT organization there. And the first job I had there, and one of the reasons I was this is a long story of how did I get here today. But the first job that I had while I was there was working in essentially the support organization. And a couple months into that job, I thought, wow, I didn't ask enough questions about what this job is all about. And I am definitely paying the dues for all of the things I put into production in my 20s and never had to think about running. And now I'm paying those dues in my 30s. And so, to me, that was the first, recognition of, it's always, I think it's always very easy to build, develop, deploy something to production, but to actually do the operations of it is incredibly difficult. And so that's, I think that's when I first started to build that kind of DevOps empathy across how we have to work across different teams. Then I spent some time in security at Target as well. In my last probably 5 years, I ran the platform engineering team there. And then most recently, as I mentioned, I'm now at Optum Tech. So that's me.
And there are so many lessons and so many ideas to dive into there. But we want to hear from our other panelists, too. So, Jamie, similarly, please tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Jamie Thingelstad. I've been CTO now for a little over 20 years, running production, customer-facing, in user products. I'm currently at SBS, as you heard a few minutes ago, and lead a team of about 500 technologists in 5 different countries, delivering the largest retail platform in the world. Before that, I've had a history in companies as small as 10 people and as large as 10,000. So I was CTO for a company in the 90s that was serving financial charts and financial data to the financial services industry, a company in town called Big Charts. We were sold to CBS MarketWatch, where I became CTO and oversaw the kind of growth of that organization as the company had went public and then continued to grow. We acquired a handful of other companies. We then got bought by Dow Jones, where I then oversaw really an agile transformation inside of the Dow Jones technology organization, and then took over as heading up the Dow Jones B2B products. So probably the most stressful product I ever had responsibility for was the Dow Jones Industrial Average. You may have heard of it. It's fairly watched. And then at the end, I was CTO for the consumer-facing aspects of the Wall Street Journal Digital Network. After a long run there, I ended up took some time off. I had some fun with the family, and then I went back into startup mode and built a company in the social commerce space called 8th Bridge. Bridget was part of our team there.
I worked for Jamie there. It was fun.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun. We built up a solid platform, raised 15 million paid in capital, and essentially our mission was to connect the Facebook social graph into e-commerce sites' product detail pages. And ultimately had good successes and some misses there, and then after there, that's when I came to SBS. I'm a builder. People sometimes describe me as an entrepreneur. I actually don't describe myself as an entrepreneur. I love to build. I love to build teams. I love to build platforms, products, cultures. That's what I love to do. So my hobbies, in fact, involve often building things, and then I just walk away because I'm like, wow, that was fun. Now time to build something else. So I've been in technology since I was very young. One of my claims to fame was in the University of Minnesota, where I also met Sammy on IRC and Bridget. Hands up for who knows IRC. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, good. About a third of the room.
Yeah, that warms my heart a little bit. But we were hanging out in Palm Macintosh, where you got the Mosaic browser was being developed, and you could download the beta, and every web server that existed in the world was pre-populated in the bookmarks, which was pretty fun. So, anyways, I've always been a huge fan of technology. It's what I do, and I get the privilege of being able to do it both for fun and for what I do at work. So.
Awesome. I love it. Okay, so we'll get an opportunity to have you ask some of your questions, but I'm going to start things out with a couple of questions myself, because I think when you start with, you start talking about DevOps, and maybe people want to sell you their DevOps solution, or they definitely have a way to dev some ops or whatever. But I think that there's some good summaries of it, has something to do with people and process and tools. And we end up focusing on the tools a lot. We sometimes have entire talks at this meetup all about the tools. And I think this is not going to be the discussion here tonight, right? Like, we're going to talk a little bit at a higher abstraction level, because the processes and the people end up taking up a lot of energy and time. So I guess I would love to hear, maybe start with Heather, but feel free to jump in, Jamie, bounce some ideas off each other. When you're starting to try to make iterative improvement, and I'm going to preface it with that, because we all know that if you decide to change all the things at once, 18 months from now, you look at your entire transformation and you go, we probably should have retooled a couple times in there. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about iterative change.
Yeah, so I've had the opportunity, so I'm in kind of my second opportunity to help drive some transformation at a very large enterprise scale. And I'm going to answer, so I'm just going to say, I think the first thing that's most important, I'm working through it with a team right now, is making work visible so that we understand what's happening and we understand what our priorities are and we understand why we're doing the work. And it sounds very basic, as though I started working with this team probably about 6 months or so ago. Actually, it was maybe a little bit longer than that. I said, we can say no to people that are requesting us to do work. And it was the first time that team had heard that they could say no to people. And I said, well, holy smokes, if we can't say no, how is it that we're ever going to be successful in what it is that we're doing? And so I think just the super basics of what is it that we're doing, how does our team have visibility to it, and how do we have visibility in one place? And so especially when we have teams that are more very focused on operations, there will be multiple different ways that they intake work. And having to move back and forth between different systems makes it incredibly difficult, and to the point where people feel like they're constantly running around with their hair on fire. And that's not the way that we have to work, and that's not a very productive way for us to work either. So I guess that, for me, that's where I would start.
Yeah, so I think a lot about outcomes. So because as a leader, we don't get the ability, and nor should we, to kind of tell how the work should be done. I mean, we focus on what are the outcomes that we want to achieve, and what I would say is that you can be intentional with those outcomes to drive the kind of change that you need to or want to see happen in the organization. I'll give you a good example. One of the tenets that we focus on a lot, and I focus on a lot, is that teams that ship more win more. By the way, feel free to use that. I have a trademark on it. But teams that ship more win more. And what I mean by that is, so just do the math, right? If you have a group of people, let's just say you have two groups of people, and they're of equal capability. I'd like to think that my team is maybe a little smarter than the average, but on average, let's say it's equal capability. One team ships 200 times, the other team in the same period of time ships 20 times. One team gets 200 chances to decide if they're right or wrong, the other team gets 20. 200 choices to be right or wrong, I win every single time. And so the way you can influence that from a leadership perspective is you start tracking it and graphing it and metricing it, and you don't even necessarily need to create a goal. The simple act of measuring it will ensure that the thing you measure happens more frequently. And I can tell you, for example, here at SPS, when we first started tracking that, we were shipping into production around 20 times a month, and we now ship into production around 400 times a month. So I get 400 times to be right or wrong. And that to me is the outcome that I want to see happen. Now, how is that happening? That's happening because people are adopting DevOps principles. You might try to do it other ways, but you can very clearly point out the teams that are doing that well, and how they're doing that is by adopting DevOps principles and DevOps practices and culture. So that's to me, if you fundamentally believe that DevOps, to a certain extent like Agile, is a way of thinking and being more than it is a thing of tools and process, then you have to say, well, what is thinking and being? Well, that's culture. And the way that you impact culture is by identifying carrots and sticks, and then helping an organization kind of get to that goal. Because you can't mandate the outcome. You have to create the right incentives for that.
I couldn't agree more, and would pile on the as a leadership team, and depending on the culture in your organization, this is often where enterprise IT organizations need to spend a lot of time, is shifting the culture from having a leadership team that's a top-down command and control, I'll tell you what to do and don't do anything unless I tell you that is the way, to instead, exactly what Jamie said, is as a leadership team, we should be setting the priorities, the guardrails, the objectives, the value, and then the team that is closest to the work needs to be making the decisions about how to make that happen and how to implement it. It's super important, and the culture, I can just say, I've seen it, I'm in my second kind of enterprise IT organization watching a transformation, and that is fundamental to any kind of change that you'll see.
Now, I think there's sometimes a fear at various levels of leadership that if you push decisions to the edge, and if you let people make decisions at the lowest possible level to be efficient and move quickly, there is a fear that I've seen at many enterprises that people might pick the wrong thing, whatever you're defining the wrong thing to be, or maybe people are gonna practice some resume-driven development. They'll just go build that custom Erlang message bus because they don't like the idea of using the commercial off-the-shelf software, or they don't want to spend the time integrating with something that another team did because they like having ownership over their thing. Or maybe they just really want to have worked on something exciting they can put on their resume. How do you balance the giving teams the autonomy that they need to get their work done with the keeping them from chasing their own tails or doing completely unproductive things that don't serve the enterprise's needs? How do you balance that?
Make the right thing to do the easy thing to do within the organization.
Yeah.
And so again, coming from the kind of the platform engineering team, where again I have thousands of developers as my primary customers. If I have a platform that's difficult to use, cumbersome to use, it's a pain, takes hours and hours to deploy something on it, nobody's going to want to come and work with the thing that I have.
They take their credit card and go to some public cloud provider and stop listening to you.
Exactly. So that, and I think it's very important to have a lightweight, especially in big enterprise IT organizations, to have a lightweight enterprise architecture function that applies the concept of call it Hadoop, what's our preferred technology, what's acceptable, what's discouraged, what's unacceptable, right? And then as an organization in our different teams, we say, here's what we prefer to use within our org because we've paid the licensing costs, or whatever the reason might be, and that's how we kind of manage and provide some guardrails. But we're not. You don't want to mandate specifically what every team is doing, because otherwise you squash innovation. So that's a really good way, I believe, to provide guardrails, but also enable innovation.
Yeah, I agree with a ton of what you said, Heather. The thing that I go back to when I think about this is what are you really trying to protect against? So most people don't have an admiration for central planning. So what is it that you're actually trying to solve by doing that? You're trying to manage risk. And so if you think of what are the other ways that you can manage risk inside of your technology organization, I often think that it's about whitelisting, it's more about blacklisting than whitelisting. So for example, I think you need to declare clear boundaries that say, this is where we as an organization and a team have made investments. We have not made investments over there, so we're not gonna go there. At least we're not gonna go there individually. We may decide to go there as a team in the future, but not individually. And I also think that when you look at it as managing risk, that's an easier way to sell that concept, because people don't want to be told what they can and can't do, But if you put them in the mindset of, well, let's think about 3 years from now. How are we going to be staffing this? How are we going to be maintaining it? Are you going to want to be still working on this? Probably not. You probably want to do something else. And then that allows you, it gets people to think a little bit differently about it. I agree with you on the enterprise architecture thing is a bit of a quandary that I think few organizations do well.
Very few
Very
do
few.
it well. And I think that's what, like, I'm very intentional when I say it's a super small, like a handful of people.
Yeah, it's
kinda.
and like lowercase e, lowercase a.
Yes, absolutely.
Like-
Working to empower the engineers,
Yes.
like being like stewards for the engineers,
Yeah.
I think is a very important tenet for enterprise architecture.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when it's a big E and a big A,
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
And-
And with the objective, so like this is an active topic for me is, and with what is it done well? Well, it done well is managing long-term risk,
Yeah.
right? Like that's what enterprise architecture done well is you do not have enterprise level refactoring. Like if you have enterprise level refactoring, you're not doing enterprise architecture well. So.
And this is interesting to me because what you're describing there can, and very much I've seen it feel very cumbersome, very heavyweight. And I wonder if it has something to do with what we touched on earlier about that sense of ownership. Like what people's investment and ownership and their sense of connection to the project or whatever, like especially when you have large organizations that are made up of maybe teams that have come together through mergers or, you know, entire groups that have come in through an acquisition and now maybe have to work on something slightly different than what they chose to sign up for. I'm curious how you approach people's sense of ownership on something large, because it's so easy when it's a fun little startup like what Jamie and I were at together. It's like, why, yes,
Oh, everyone owns everything then.
everyone owns everything and everyone's on call for everything.
Yes.
But like when you do have something much bigger, it's harder, I think, to have people get that sense of identity and ownership around the stuff that they're connected to. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how, in a large organization, you can make that work.
Yeah, so this was actually one of the things that I'm a very strong believer in. So we have a simplified view of our architecture that we reference very frequently. And that simplified view of architecture, by the way, maps all the way to like a go-to-market that our product team could look at and say like, yep, that's our go-to-market products. All of the shared services infrastructure behind it, cloud infra behind it, all that stuff. And I am I'm very insistent that teams must know which parts of that they own. So a good test for me is if I can go to anybody in a technology organization and show them that diagram and say, which part of this do you own? They should all be able to say like, yep, I have that. Then having standalone dashboards and metrics for each one of those teams, so they have their own kind of service availability metrics. They access shared services infrastructure, like you can't possibly have every team have a 24/7 level 1 team, but you can make sure that they all have access to that 24/7 level 1 team. But that clear identification of the boundary and then through the definition of your architecture, reinforcing that ownership, I think is really important. And that's also something I think I don't know, sometimes tech organizations do this, sometimes they don't. We very firmly believe, and I very firmly believe, that people are aligned to a product or a service for a long time. So we don't do project-based resourcing. So, and the reason for that is that project-based resourcing, I think, does not incentivize teams to build for the long term, because you own it for a project, then you're off, it's somebody else's problem. If you own a service for the indefinite future, you will make better decisions about how that future runs. And so some would call that service teams. I struggle with that a little bit. You can be a little pedantic about what that means and if you had to order 3 pizzas or 2, you know, yeah, some people like to eat a lot of pizza.
Yeah, how hungry are these people?
so, so I think you can take that too far, but that basic idea, that basic concept is important. Now, I will also tell you, in a sufficiently large organization, you always have horizontal capabilities. You always have shared services. You're always going to have that set of Oracle databases that do not fit into any service team. But I think it's a very easy, actually, the answer to that, I think, is right in front of us. It's basic software encapsulation. You just say, well, that's a service. Okay, done. And you're like, okay, then it all makes sense. So
I couldn't agree more. And
Yeah.
I think that within the big enterprise IT organizations, one of the biggest fundamental shifts is that change from a project-based, I'm going to pull together, 30 different people. Hey, oh, hooray, I got some funding and passed the request. I'm going to pull together this group of people. I'm going to work on the thing for 18 months, and then I'm going to throw it over the wall to whatever that support organization
to the ops
is.
team.
To the ops team.
Yeah.
And it just
Sadness as a service.
fundamentally, it doesn't drive the right kind of behaviors. And so the shift from project to product is fundamental. And really incredibly important. And then defining what are those shared services and providing them as a service to those product teams.
Yeah.
So couldn't agree more.
We had I thought that was one of the things that we did recently is the level 1 24/7 team, right? So that team's objective is to, at 100, every minute, every second of the day, they need to know the availability of all of our services. They look totally horizontal, right? They look nothing like a service team. But they actually sat down and said, like, hey, what if we had kind of a metaphorical API? What would that look like? And well, the API would allow people to register a service to be monitored by us. And they said, like, oh, well, maybe our services could expose some YAML that we could use to then pull this in. And they effectively kind of reverse engineered a human-based function into like a service interface, which I thought was really cool.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And of
Let's
course
talk
it was
more about
YAML.
But yeah, I would like just to underscore, and I don't know how many folks in the like I'd say that change in an enterprise IT org from even just defining what your products are, like how do you build a product organization, how do you align your engineering teams to like that is a mountain to overcome. It takes a really long time to do that.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Now, and there's so much under the surface here that I feel like we could spend a lot of time on that. But I want to dive into the cautionary tales, like the rabbit holes that redacted or not, that you have gone down or seen people go down, that maybe in retrospect were not a great use of time. Some of the cautionary tales. I would love to hear when people are starting to put their product teams together and to dev some ops, what should they not do?
Well, I'll jump in. So, maybe this isn't quite as prescriptive, but one of the things that I would comment is that you always have to understand, particularly in whatever leadership role you have, and that doesn't necessarily mean you manage 30 people, right? Everybody is a thought leader, an organizational leader. Like if you want to affect change in your organization, beware of what you're doing. You're executing organizational change or cultural change. And the thing I would highlight first and foremost is changing organizations is a slow process, and you cannot expect it to just happen overnight. For example, with one of the things that we do is we always pick a set of things every year that we're going to improve in our Agile practice and our DevOps practice. And that's because we just know that we always want to move the needle to better. And we know we can't do it all at once. So just pick a couple of things every year, and then we can really focus on those. There's this concept that I like to think about, and I think it's worth naming, and that's the organizational dissonance between where you want to be and where you are. And you need to make sure, like in my role, I think part of my job is to understand what is the maximum amount of that dissonance, because I want to be able to move the organization as fast as possible, but not lose the organization. And I can tell you, like, there's times when I've tried to say, like, well, we really should be operating this way, and then let's do that. And that doesn't work at all because the technology just does not enable that. You know, you can't wish service boundaries to exist where they don't exist today. And no matter what you do, like, that's gonna bite you. So I think that there's this act of kind of knowing what's the maximum rate that I can move a culture and not break it to come along, and be cognizant of that and patient with that. I think is really important. If you're impatient or easily discouraged, those are not good qualities for changing culture.
Agreed. I think the patience is key, and as well, the people that know me are always surprised to hear me say that I'm actually a pretty risk-averse person. And I would say, well, yeah, no, I'm risk-averse because I have a lot of production accountabilities, and maybe I'm a little bit lazy, but I hate waking up at 2 in the morning. So, like, I will do my best to protect production as we're making different cultural changes, right? And that means, like, yes, we have here's our North Star of where we're going for, like, where we want to be organizationally, culturally, how we're doing our work, but it's definitely stepping into that. And Bridget, as you asked your question, and Jamie, as you were answering, I thought, gosh, what are those things just like right now where I'm just like, you know what, it's not quite time to focus on that. And this one is classic, I think, in a big enterprise IT organization. It's the change management process, right? And so change management processes at large IT organizations are intentionally slow and cumbersome and slow you down, so you're not doing 200 deploys a week, a month. I can't remember.
400 a month.
400 a month, right? So, like, almost intentionally
That'd be a
slow,
lot of
so you're
meetings.
not doing that. Right? That'd be a lot of meetings.
That'd be a lot of
That'd be a lot of
changes.
meetings.
The change control review board would be very busy.
It'd be very
It'd
busy.
very
I gotta tell you, when I had a change control process I had to care about, turns out emergency changes you were allowed to file after the fact. It's amazing how many things were an emergency.
And so it's almost so you're just like, well, you can't tackle the mountain of a process that has been built up over many years and has been, kind of at the foundation, say, of like proving stability for a really large organization. And I think the way to tackle that I've seen some success with is instead, okay, well, let's show on the side over here some small changes where we're deploying in the middle of the day. We're not impacting production. We show success again. You have some data points, some metrics. Then all of a sudden you can have a data-driven conversation with the team that owns change management, that owns those audit processes, right? That are accountable to different boards to report out on that process. Then you can have a really productive conversation, and that's how you start to break down those really big entrenched processes. But it takes time, and you have to be really patient, and you can't get frustrated with it. It's kind of like a fun, you have to smile as you're doing it. Be like, this is actually really fun and interesting to figure out how it is that we chip away.
You're bringing that up. I guess another thing I would throw out is that in a large enough organization, it's always, people ask, well, what technology do you use? It's like, well, in a large enough organization, all of them.
All of them.
And
all the clouds.
yeah. And one of the things that I think is worth highlighting is that you can't apply binary thinking to this stuff, right? So you can't say because I've actually had people say well, the fact that we have a change control process means we don't do DevOps because somebody at a conference somewhere said something. And I'm like,
Conference-driven development,
yeah.
not actually a thing.
Yeah. And you just have to accept that it's all about managing risk, right? And if you can show that your risk is low, then you can remove those things. We're actually working towards a thing where you can essentially look at your track record, and your deployment track record will allow you to opt out. So if you prove that when you do things it doesn't cause problems, then we're going to remove things from you, right?
Yep.
And so so binary thinking is bad in a lot of areas, but that particularly if you're dealing with cultural transformations.
So I think we're getting towards the end of our time, which just makes me sad because we have a great conversation happening. But as we're kind of giving people a little bit more guidance before we take a question or two from the audience, what would you say are some good, you mentioned the North Star, just some good roadmap items? Say people are in an organization where they are, in fact, trying to transform into a modern technology organization that can move at the speed of business and accomplish everything they want to without being encumbered, the dream. Starting with Heather, perhaps maybe what would you recommend people put on the initial couple of mile markers of their roadmap? Especially, and I'm gonna throw one out there because I know you've talked about this before. State, the place where your customers and money live, but yet it's so hard. Yeah. So like that, and anything else, where would you recommend them starting?
Yeah, for anyone that talks to me, and I think I said what my job was at OptumTech, I think the true core to I shouldn't say the true. Anyways, I'm a little biased to say having access to our core enterprise data in easy, reusable ways is essential for us to be able, for engineering teams and product teams to be able to move quickly. So if we don't have access to APIs to whatever industry that we're in, I've worked in retail, I'm now in healthcare, right? So in retail, if I don't have access to a product API, a locations API, an inventory API, and I have to go out there and every time I'm trying to build something, I have to do that integration myself, that's really gonna slow me down. And so you can imagine, whatever industry we're all in, that is essential to being able to move quickly. And then I'm just gonna repeat what I said, the two other things, which is moving towards product teams, which is incredibly, incredibly difficult if that's not how your organization thinks about their work. And then also just visibility to the work, and then empowering the engineering teams that are closest to the work to here's what it is that's important. These are our objectives. These are priorities, guardrails. Please go and do and solve the problems because you're closest to the work.
I'd highlight, so I think oftentimes in technology we don't, we could take a cue from our sales partners and focus on outcomes. So I always tell people I've coached dozens of CIOs and CTOs I met. Never sell architecture. Nobody buys architecture. Nobody buys process. Nobody buys your methodology. They buy outcomes. And so really focus on the outcomes. I think if you focus on, hey, would it be beneficial to us if we ship more frequently? Would it be beneficial for us if we can do roll forwards instead of roll backs? Would it be beneficial for us if we sat down with our customers and really engaged in what they needed? I would just focus on those outcomes, and I wouldn't bother mentioning any of the technology terms associated with that. That's the how. It's not the why. And I would tell you, I just think there's some disease we get in tech where we get so enamored with the what. I get presentations dozens of times a week, and half the time I'm like, okay, we're 30 minutes in, and I know all sorts of stuff about what you're doing. I don't know why.
What are you trying to accomplish?
Apparently, we're going to do some stuff, though. It's going to be awesome for somebody.
For their resume.
But I think that's where I would focus on. Evangelize the outcome. Why is it that this is meaningful to your customer? And that's where I think you'll get engagement.
Have you found that, sorry, this is, I can
Yeah.
ask you offline, but have you found that
First
with
question.
your close partnership with I know you have a really strong product organization with your engineering organization, does that help with the articulation? Because I know engineering,
It does, because oftentimes the product team's on the why. But I would say I also push pretty hard that the technology leaders need to know the why too. You need to internalize that. And the other thing is that the product leaders will only go to a certain level, and particularly when you get to shared capabilities, it's harder for them to represent the why. I think it also, by the way, it helps to have in a large organization, if you have a whole portfolio, it really helps if you have the data to be able to point at certain teams and say, well, look at that. I mean, one of the things that I love is in the release often area, like there are a handful of teams, Nate here is on one of them, that releases all the time. And
looks like he's releasing right now.
It probably is.
And Andy
Might have something to
Domeyer,
do with pager-duty, I don't know.
and Jamie, Andy Domeyer was at Moderator out in
Moderator?
Portland
Yeah.
presenting about a whole bunch of your observability.
Yeah. So I just like no business person I know has ever said, I wish we couldn't move faster. Everybody wants to move faster. So I just
Or
focus
like
on
that's the success of an engineering team, right? When your product team or business team says, hold it, time out.
slow down.
We don't need you to move faster
Yeah,
anymore.
slow down.
Who's heard that before?
A few.
Success.
So
Great, nice. Okay, well, we have some hands already. And Nate, do we have another mic? I'm not sure. I'm going to run this mic. That's fine. I will run the mic around. And we're going to hear from a few folks with questions.
it might
Thank
not.
you.
It might
Thank you for your time. It was quite good. I have 3 questions, so I'll answer whichever way you want. First, during your speak, you were making something I'm not sure I did get. Did you make a difference between Agile and DevOps? Because for me, they are not. They cannot be segregated one to the other. Second one, I'm totally with you on architecture. In your company, do you teach JITA? Do you make just-in-time architecture part of your curriculum for your solution architects? And third question, for the number of deployment that you do you also apply Canary, blue-green type of approach, or do you do straight out all your deployments?
Can I take the first
Yeah,
one?
yeah.
I really
You
want the
look
first
really
one.
excited.
I am. I'm really excited about that. I'm so excited that you asked that question. So you asked the question of Agile and DevOps. Can you separate them? To me, they are two sides of a coin, right? And let me just take a moment to go a little bit deeper because I think that this is meaningful. And perhaps I just get enamored with concepts, but I really think about refactoring a lot because to me, refactoring is it's a mistake, right? Ideally, we would all build solutions and we would never refactor. That's never going to happen. So we're going to acknowledge that's silly, but we want to drive the cost of refactoring down as much as possible. And in my mind, the reason that Agile became a possibility was because the cost of refactoring software went down. So if you were building in assembly, the cost of refactoring is high. I don't think you should ever use Agile for a project built in assembly because Agile has a higher likelihood of refactoring. There's a trade-off there. But if the cost of refactoring goes down, no, I can do Agile, then that makes sense. To me, DevOps is the other half of that coin. And by the way, enabled with cloud, right? The same way that the fact that I could build software quickly and easily on a laptop computer, preferably, made Agile possible. Disposable infrastructure in the cloud made DevOps possible. That's the enabler, right? And so together, those have to come together. It's odd to me that I don't think that, it's odd to me that hasn't come together actually better. It's surprising to me because I do just see it as you're the same thing. One came from the side of software, one came from the side of infrastructure, one enabled by high-level programming languages and cheap CPU, the other enabled by cloud infrastructure and disposable infrastructure. Both coming to the same spot, right?
Can I just add in there too, just real quick,
Yeah.
because we've talked about
I got
this,
really
the
excited
product,
about it. Yeah.
the product component of it as well,
Yeah.
right? Is I think all 3 of those are
Yeah.
super, super important and different sides of the coin, but together.
Mm-hmm.
The essential part of it also is when you go really to the lean concept and you apply the lean really approach of it, you do have a much higher level of merger part of it. And I would like to talk to you offline because I'm not sure I fully agree with the refactoring being a bad thing.
No, I don't. Refactoring is not a bad thing. The cost of refactoring is a bad thing.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, that I agree with.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I should
Yeah.
desire to refactor as frequently as possible for $0.
Yeah, which is
Yep.
Uh,
Let's make sure we got to your other questions.
oh yeah, I don't. Just-in-time architecture, not a thing
It's,
I do.
yeah, Jita, and when you do that many deployment in your normal process, do you go straight deployment or do you go blue, green, canary, any type of style at that level?
For us, it depends on the service team. Most service teams do a blue-green. That's the preferred. They can do it other ways, and if they do, they have certain limiters applied. So, you. It's got a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Hey, you give me the mic. Okay.
Last question. You're cut off.
Specifically on that, do you also do automatic smoke testing with reversal of deployment if they fail?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yes, if
Thank
you're
you.
doing that many deployments. Sorry,
I'm gonna-
I'm
I'm gonna-
quiet
Yeah.
because in my current role, I am
You're getting there.
working to modernize the way that we actually develop and deploy our.
Yeah.
And I'm actually going to jump in on this one and say, we all know we don't have time machines, right? Like, there is no such thing as a rollback. You roll forward to a state that you hope is really similar to the past state that you kind of miss.
Yeah. And you kind of cry when I.
Just keep that in mind. It's like Cher talks about turn back time, but that is not a thing.
I mean, to your question, all of those things, that would fall in the bucket, in my mind, of best practices that you should adopt, and if you do, there's carrots to adopting them, and if you don't, then there's certain, not so much a stick, but there's certain other things you may have to do to compensate for your lack of adoption.
Yeah. And I think as well, it's just like the different engineering implementation decisions that you're making of like, are you using technologies that are open source and your engineers can see the code and like what's automated, what's not automated, like that's a complicated question.
No, don't do that.
I'll have to talk about that one after.
Haven't heard, I honestly, I hadn't heard that
Yeah.
term used,
Yeah, I
that,
haven't either.
yeah, so.
Right?
Hello. So I like your thinking process of focusing on the outcome and not getting overly involved in the stuff that comes beforehand. But I'm going to play devil's advocate with you for a minute. If you talk about an outcome, people are going to achieve it. And how do you know that people aren't delivering 400 lines of individual code, you know, and gaming the system? Is there a way when you're doing your metrics that
So-
you're not being gamed?
So so I've thought about that, and one great way to answer that is I don't know that I care. I mean, you might get a hollow win, but even if you did that, I actually know that your deployment process works well. You might be gaming the deployment process to get some other thing, but I don't. I have thought about that at times, and I've kind of put it in the bucket because you could say like, well, what if you did 400 deployments that had no business value? Well,
Or what if you did 400 deployments at 2 in the morning and burned all your people out?
Right.
well,
There are externalities to
yeah,
like.
most of the teams doing that are fully automated, but so there's no people involved except the person hitting go. But I don't know that I care. I think that's a manager, like, yeah, the managers and product owners need to think about that, but on a leadership level, yeah. It'll flush itself out. To me, that's the same question as, well, how do you know that a salesperson isn't padding their pipeline with probability to close metrics? Well, I don't. I didn't talk to all those people. But if they keep doing that, they're not going to be successful. So.
I mean, I think as well, it just like speaks to the importance of what is it that you're measuring, right? Because what you measure is what your teams will do. I'm personally not a huge fan of MBOs and like setting of goals once a year, usually in like a December timeframe for what will be achieved over the course of the next 12 months, and then kind of measuring success over the next 12 months. Like I think that's kind of a dangerous way as well to set objectives for teams, because there's no way that we know. There's no way that we know 13 months, 14 months in advance what it is that's going to happen. I think it's more important to set those like North Star key objectives. Where in a great world do we want to be? And then how do we show incrementally, I don't know, holding a soda can so I can't, and then how do we show incrementally over time that we're achieving that? Not like, oh geez, you know, like team X, you're not meeting your goal that you said you would 6 months ago, and so kind of like X red mark on you. So I don't know, kind of my 2 cents on measuring stuff.
Yeah, and you're right. You are going to get what you measure. People are going to come up with some way. So
Yep.
think hard about what you ask for.
So there's a little bit of discussion from your shirt regarding just the practices from SPS on maybe community and practices, community practice, and sharing. Could you just share a little bit about how you feel like how important it is to have that exercise of a community practice and sharing information across an organization that is doing transformation or trying to do Agile or DevOps methods and practices?
Yeah, I think it's super important actually, and this is something I've never, I had never formalized it as we do here until this role. So, and honestly, I haven't seen it applied like we do here, many places else, or many other places. On the big picture, what I say is, communities exist. This is a community, right? This is the Twin Cities DevOps Meetup community. We have shared sets of interests and come together and have this kind of dialogue. We have forms and functions that make that work. I don't think enough people think of their company as a community. Your company, yes, your company is an org chart. That's a fact, right? And if you look at like in our team, we have a set of things that happen that are aligned with the org chart. So like every couple months I have a all hands meeting, and that all hands meeting exists because I'm the CTO and everybody is in my team. And so there's a whole set of things that happen that are aligned with the org chart, and I call that the corporate track. That's the corporate communication track. Then there's an entirely set of things other set of things that happen that are in the community track that have nothing to do with the org chart. They are ignorant of the org chart. And as much as possible, what we tried to do is create a complete mirror. So every year we have an event, like we get our whole company together, right? And then we have a tech event that is the annual event for the technology team. I lead it off, and all the VPs talk and blah, blah, blah. So we have an annual event. Every year we have an annual community event. It's our Tech Jam event. I attend Tech Jam as a member. I'm a member of the community. I don't set the agenda. There's a group of people that do that, and they make that happen. And what we've tried to do as much as possible, because we tried a few things and they didn't work, we decided like open source it. So let's just copy what happens in the community. So Tech Jam is not that different than a conference. Like we execute a CFP. Internal employees put in CFP submissions and get picked. We have a monthly meetup that actually is structured exactly like a community meetup. The only difference is the community is our technology community inside the company. We have, we call them guilds, which is a little anachronistic, but kind of birds of a feather groups that get together that have certain things. Like right now we have a guild being formed around GraphQL. So GraphQL, horizontal technology, used in a lot of our teams. Let's get a guild together for that because that's a cross-functional thing. So the main thing that we have to do as an organization is we make sure that we associate appropriate value and give time for that. It's a small amount of budget that I set aside to enable it, but I think it's differentiating. I really do. And I think just taking, even if you didn't do any of those specifics, just saying, hey, my company is a community. How would I engage with my company as a community? And how would that be different? I think that's a great question to ask yourself. Because you are a community. So.
And I think, Heather, you've put some time and effort into getting people across the company to talk to each other at these internal events. If you were advising someone who is planning to do something like that, what would you tell them to do?
It is incredibly important. I think just getting like the grassroots aspect of the community is really important. I think it's not, if it comes for whatever reason from tops down, it won't be authentic. And so providing the funding to do it, providing the opportunities and encouraging people to do it, I think is incredibly important. And even just within, like you say, horizontal technologies, something just as easy as whatever chat tool it is that your company is using, whether it's Slack or HipChat or whatever it is, those different channels that get created, tend to start, you start to see really strong communities forming around that. And even then you start to see people showing up as the I am the, I'm the go-to person in XYZ in graphs. So, and encourage that person, or those people to come together as a community. I think that's a great way to do it. But yeah, I can talk at length as well about organizing different events and how that happens. And I think it's really, really incredibly important to help create a software engineering culture. Because again, I think within big enterprise IT organizations, it's a bit of a different battle to shift, to start to shift that culture.
All right, I think we have one more. Okay, we have one more question.
I got a
It's like the
one-on-one.
question roll.
Yeah, this is, well, we're leveraging off each other.
Okay.
Are we on? Okay. So this will be a little different. So on the way over here, I biked past US Bank Stadium, and I watched it be built from my office window on the Capella Tower. And it was built in 18 months, and I don't think anyone in Minnesota would imagine that it wouldn't have been built by November or July 13th on schedule in time for the first Vikings game. There's complete confidence that they were going to build that. $1 billion stadium with a $50 million Mortensen construction overhead, less than 5%. Are they just that much farther ahead than we are? It's a waterfall project. I mean, you put in the foundation and then you build it up. And is that a model? Is that the path we're eventually going to go back to? Because in software, we go back and forth all the time. Is that something we should look to? It's a 4,000-year-old industry. We're 40 years old. I mean, are we going to go in that direction, or are we that much different? But we have 35-40% overhead with management and everybody looking at everything. And these guys, and it was in the paper. There was a $30,000 discrepancy, and everybody knew about it, and they were pointing fingers on $1 billion project. I'm just thinking about that. It'd be interesting in your thoughts. Is that our model, or is that still something that we can aspire to go back to waterfall?
No.
Deliver a project, let all the programmers go, like all the builders go away, and you got this amazing 40-year-old stadium.
So the real quick thought. So sorry, no. But and then the corresponding thought that comes afterwards is, okay, so it's a set thing, it is. Building software is an iterative process where you have to work through it with the team. The reason waterfall doesn't work for building software is, and we've seen this time and time and time again, is business comes to us and, oh, okay, here's your list of 100 requirements, 1,000 requirements. Please go build that thing. And then we come back 18 months later and we say, here's your thing. And they're like, what? That's not relevant anymore. That's not what I wanted. That doesn't work. We have to build together to actually.
Well, because you can tell when it's done.
So I go back to, I think it's a valid question. So a couple of things I'd make an observation of. Probably that building was done and redone in CAD 100 times over 7 years before anybody put a shovel in the ground. So it wasn't 18 months. That's not true. And amazing technology would have been used to ensure that what they actually made was what they thought they were making, right? But it's the cost. I go back to this cost of refactoring. If you put a post in the wrong spot, you can't just decide tomorrow to move it. It's in cement. Your cost of refactoring is near infinite. Yeah. And so I would actually suggest, I'll be a little bit more nuanced. I'm a huge, I don't do waterfall. I've always done Agile. Like people say, like, well, it's just how I've always built software. There's like something in the water wrong. Everybody's doing Agile, but it's like, thought we got over that 20 years ago. But I will tell you, if I was building something that had a huge risk factor and the cost of refactoring was extremely high, A, I don't know if I'm the right person to build it, and B, if I did, I would not use Agile. So I just think you have to look at, like, it's not one size fits all. If your cost of refactoring is near infinite, you need to be planful. You need to know what the hell you're building. Like, you know, but I mean, we all seek to, like, I think our goal in technology is to seek to reduce the cost of refactoring, to be agile, because we know we don't really know what we're building, and then to go with it, right? But that's an entirely different, it's not a better, it's what are you doing? What are you trying to make? I'm pretty sure that, you know, even SpaceX, that everybody loves, pretty sure when they shoot a rocket up into the stratosphere, that, like, there's probably a lot of waterfall there, because you can't just, like, say, like, well, let's just change it.
In fact, I can confirm, I know some engineers at SpaceX. There's a lot of stuff that you have to decide before you shoot that rocket.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like you're saying, if you have an iterative process that you're constantly reacting to customer needs, it's not like you shoot a rocket off and check on it much later.
Yeah. And I do think, you know, Bridget said, you know when it's done. I do think that's there is a thing there. Software is never done.
Oh, it's done when it's decommissioned.
Yeah. Like I said, software's never done. And so you have to, it lives and breathes in different ways. So, but.
Okay, I know more people have questions, but since we have our panelists are going to want to go and, you know, leave at some point, we are going to call it here and give you the traditional attempt to come rush the stage and chat with them before they have to flee. So let's give it up for Jamie and Heather.
Thank you, Bridget, for being an excellent moderator.